Professor Martin Murray is going to be our first speaker, and he's really going to look at dispelling some of the myths we may have about Africa today. So, Martin Murray is a tenured full professor of the Tubman College Urban Planning faculty, and I just learned a fascinating story about who Tubman really is, so if you Google him, it's interesting. He began his academic career as a sociologist with a strong foundation in urban geography. His current research engages the field of urban studies and planning, global urbanism, cultural geography, distressed urbanism, development, historical sociology, and African studies. In addition to 6 books and 3 co-edited volumes, he has produced close to 17 journal articles and book chapters that focus on diverse geographical areas in the world at different historical periods. He's completed 2 books on city building and spatial politics in Johannesburg after apartheid. His current research focuses on 2 fields of inquiry. First, the trajectories of global urbanism at the start of the 21st century, and second, the turn toward master planned, holistically designed private cities built from scratch, especially those currently under construction or in the planning stages in urban Africa. And I think we were talking, it'll be a nice contrast to the organic city of Algiers that we looked at yesterday, to look at these cities from scratch. I'm going to stop there, only to add that I'm particularly excited because Professor Murray taught for many years at Binghamton, my alma mater. And I'm sad I never took a course with you, so I get to take one today. So welcome, Professor Murray.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and it's a difficult task that I have because you really haven't, over the course of your study in this program, had a lot of time to really look at contemporary cities and city building in Africa. So I have to sort of fill in a lot of gaps. And it's quite a daunting task that I have and that Garth has. So I'll do the best I can. Partly what I'm going to try to do is dispel what I think are sort of like lingering myths, which you may hold or may not hold. But that's sort of the way I'm going to tackle this, and more kind of in a framework of sort of anecdotes and maybe some stories to try to, to sort of open up some space to get you to think about things in maybe ways that you haven't before. I'm going to pass around 2 brochures that I have, and I definitely need these back. The first one is a place called, and I'll talk a little bit about this one in the discussion later. It's called Stain City. It's between Johannesburg and Pretoria. It's a complete city built by a single private developer named Dow Steyn, who basically has brought all these businesses into this particular place and built a walled city between Johannesburg and Pretoria. So a lot of this is highly stylized. It probably never quite reached the expectations that you find in the picture book. The second one I'm going to pass around is called Machakos. Machakos City. It's about 60 kilometers south of Nairobi. And it's one of the kind of planned cities that I'm going to talk about and show some videos about. This is one of maybe 3 or 4. There's Kanza City outside of Nairobi, about another 10 kilometers south from Machakos. There's Tatu City north of Nairobi. There's a place, Garden City, which is closer to the city center. Another place called 2 Rivers or 3 Rivers. All of these fit this model that I'm going to talk about of new city building in Africa. This place basically is not built. It may or may not ever be built, but I wanted to share with you the kind of stylized images in here that sort of capture the imagination of those that are trying to think about these things and possibly build them. There's a lot of talk that places like Machakos are really speculative investments that are not really ever intended to be built, but simply to get people to buy the land for the people who now own land and buy it at highly inflated prices. But that's something we'll find out in the future. So if you just pass them around, take a look at them. So let me just start with a few kind of general comments. One, Africa is not a country. There's a good friend of Garth's and mine, a guy named from South Africa named Sean Jacobs, who has a blog called Africa is a Country, which is a spoof. But it's a great thing if you ever want to look at what's going on today in Africa. It's very very political and very sort of up-to-date in themes and so forth. So Africa is a country. But my thing is Africa is not a country. And in part what I want to say there is that there's incredible diversity. There's incredible diversity in cities. There's incredible diversity in regions. There's incredible diversity in histories. And so there's a tendency, I think, sometimes to sort of conflate or condense Africa as one place, and I want to sort of disabuse you of that. My own views are strongly shaped by Johannesburg. It's a place that I first went to in 1977, before I was born. Oh, that's a joke to say that, yeah. When I was more of a youngster. It's a place that's changed unbelievably. But to sort of give you a sense of the historicity of places in Africa, a city like Luanda in Angola can probably trace back the history of city building there, probably 300 years or so. It was a Portuguese, Angola was a Portuguese colony. They built up Luanda over a long period of time. Luanda and Maputo, another city that was part of the Portuguese Empire. Both are strikingly similar to Lisbon. They're both built on bays. They both reflect the kind of architecture and stylistics of Portugal. And they both have long histories connected to the slave trade, and connected to the kind of extraction of resources from the center of the city, from the center of the countries, East and West Africa. In contrast, I could use some water.
Okay.
Thank you. In contrast, Johannesburg is a city that was not really officially inaugurated until 1886, after the discovery of gold. And within the next 2 decades or so, the area around Johannesburg was producing 40% of the world's gold. And the city grew up around that and still reflects the fact that it's just a dirty old mining town. I do like the place, but it is a dirty old mining town. Another point that I want to say is that urbanization in Africa is proceeding at an incredibly rapid pace. We tend, I think, a lot of times the sort of imagery of Africa is very rural. And I do think that, oh, thanks very much. I do think that much of the kind of urban dynamics are ignored, not only in scholarship, but also ignored in the kind of imagery of where Africa is going in the future. So I'm going to try to anticipate a little bit. A couple of phrases, and then I'll show you a bit of a video here, or concepts that I want to have us unsettle a bit. One is the term, we use it a lot in the term African cities. I'm a little reluctant to, if I ever say it, I really don't mean it, because I don't think there's anything. It's not African cities, as if African cities are different from Asian cities or different than Latin American cities and so forth. I want to see it as cities in Africa. The other, and that's related to this idea of the sort of hybridity of the places, that there really are assemblages of features that are drawn from all over the world. When I look at Johannesburg, every single urban issue in urban scholarship, you can find it in Johannesburg. From the mundane to the extreme, from issues with immigrants to issues with large-scale capitalist investment to issues of informality and so forth and so on. You can find that there's 200 and something informal settlements around Johannesburg alone, so-called slums, just around Johannesburg. That's not just in the country as a whole. Johannesburg, the metropolitan region, has 40% unemployment, yet at the same time it has some of the richest suburbs and the fanciest malls I've ever seen anywhere in the world. So these places are really extreme, and it's hard to make any kind of generalizations from one anecdote or from one experience. So I want to get away from this idea of African cities and look at more cities in Africa as places that are reflecting global influences, local inflections, and hybrid relationships that are drawn from other parts of Africa, other parts of Asia, and so forth. So there's nothing that that essentializes them as African, is my view. A second term, I think, or theme that we need to be careful with, and it's hard to talk about, is the term tribe. My experience in Africa is very much Southern African. If you went to ordinary people in Johannesburg and used the word tribe, they would be repelled. It's not a word that resonates. It's a word that's seen as basically a reflection in part of apartheid, of the past. It's not an identity for people at all. They may identify by language group. They may identify by historical roots in a certain area of the country, but they don't identify per se by tribe. That may change in other parts of Africa, which I know less, but I just wanted to raise that as a point that, you know, just be careful with that, that term. Two others that I'll say something about quickly before I show you something. The common tropes that usually resonate when we talk about cities in Africa, particularly these big, sprawling mega cities of hypergrowth like Kinshasa or Lagos, are the terms slum and informality. Slum, of course, is a bit of a controversial term. I mean, some people, it fits within that same genre of terms like favela or ghetto. I myself, and there's a literature that basically attacks using the word slum. I myself am not that critical if we use the term carefully. If we really understand what's actually happening. I spent a certain amount of time in Kibera, outside of Nairobi, or in Nairobi actually, which some people argue is the biggest, and Garth can probably say more about this, the biggest slum in Africa. It's an incredibly vibrant place. I mean, and there's a high unevenness in that place itself, from dozens and dozens of small manufacturing sites where people are making things for sale, whether it's furniture or whether it's tools or whatever they're making there and selling it elsewhere. On the one side, so there's a kind of an enrichment in that place. At the other side, there's extreme poverty and deprivation. And extreme hierarchies in terms of age, gender, and ethnic origin in that place itself. So a term like slum carries a sort of a centralized idea as if it's all the same, and when in fact they're not. They're highly differentiated places that have their own internal contradictions and so forth. The other term, informality. In the literature, there tends to be a kind of strong separation between the term formal and the term informal. And formal sort of fits into that category of officially sanctioned, legal, open, visible, regulated. Informal tends to be treated as invisible, illegal, unregulated, and so forth. And so one sort of represents, in the conventional literature, formal represents kind of orderliness, goodness, and efficiency, and informal represents the opposite: chaos, illegality, and so forth. I want to disabuse us of that idea. And to say that actually formal and informal are really tied very, very closely together. They can't really be separated. And maybe as we proceed, I'll make some comments about Detroit, which is like my neighborhood, because Ann Arbor is basically a suburb of Detroit. And I've learned a lot from thinking about Detroit. To give one example of the blending of formal and informal is the first time I went to Luanda in Angola to get from the airport into the center of the city. In Luanda, the city has about half the population of the country. It's maybe, who knows, anywhere 4 to 8 million people, unknown actually. It's a big, bulky city with the remnants of Portuguese, British architecture built on a hill, and so forth. But as you drive into the center of the city, it's like driving from LaGuardia to New Haven. It's a traffic jam. Except the traffic there goes a little bit slower. And there's men that line the streets selling everything from water to pens, to backpacks, to irons, and so forth. And that's what classically we think of as being the informal economy. But if we unpack it and look at it underneath, what we see is something that's actually quite different that's happening. What's happening is that shopkeepers in the old downtown, realizing that their street traffic of people walking past their shops is really limited because of overcrowded streetscape with cars, that in order to expand their business, they work on a kind of consignment business, and they give 10 mops to a guy in the morning who then takes the business away from the shop and moves it around the city. So they're intricately connected. And the work that I'm starting to do on cities elsewhere is to realize now that city building process is really taking place through exceptions. That the formal rules of land use zoning are being violated, and exceptions are being made. And this is nothing other than informality. And so in other words, formality and informality are terms that really are blended and can't be seen as separate. The term slum is not in a centralized category, but actually a highly differentiated category where informal settlements or slums or whatever have their own historicities, have their own dynamics, and they can't, it's hard to generalize about them except to say that generally speaking, it's mainly poor, very poor people who live there. So I'm going to just show about 3 or 4. Tara said that she made this particular video available for you. For me, it's one of the greatest. We'll talk about it in a minute. I'm going to only show 3 or 4 minutes of it. It's about cities in Africa. Okay, this particular video presentation is about 11 minutes long. I would encourage you, if you want to see it. I mean, I would guess that it's a bit of a surprise for you. It's highly stylized. It's propaganda, I think, in the classic good sense, in the sense that it's one-sided. It shows a one-sided picture. Notice that there's no people. And that these cities are basically seen through the lens of kind of architectural monumentality. And we could proceed for the next 7 or 8 minutes or so and show more and more of the same imagery. It's one-sided in the sense what you don't see are informal settlements, poor people, and so forth, which make up the majority of many cities, not all, but many cities in Africa. But what it does, I think, is I think, for me, it graphically portrays this idea that the kind of large-scale city-building projects have been in operation in Africa for quite some time, and have really reshaped the built environment that look very, very similar to cities that we would see in the so-called West. These images in some ways put to shame images that one would have of Detroit or or Flint, or so forth. So, in other words, what I'm trying to get us to think about is that there's some elements of city building in Africa that are certainly on a par, if not exceeding, what we would find in the West. And that it's not, and I want to dispel this idea that somehow we have to look at Africa as somehow backward and needing of remedial work, and somehow having to catch up with us. I mean, I think Detroit has to catch up with Africa. I mean, and the joke that I make, and somewhat facetiously, and I'll say it, and so don't think that I think this directly in these terms, but if Detroit allowed 10,000 Nigerians to come, it would be a completely different place in 2 years. It would be a much more vibrant, healthy place than it is today. And because Nigerians would know what to do. And we could extrapolate to other countries in Africa as well. I just want to say something and make some general comments about cities. There's a lot of discussion in the literature, and I think the discussion really points in a proper direction around the death of the city. Now, we don't see it as much living in this part of the world. But this image that we have, and it certainly persists in the literature, and I think it's embedded itself in our minds, these images that we have of cities and what cities are and how they're shaped and what form they take, still persists, maybe in North America and Western Europe, but is really not the way cities are being built in the rest of the world. And these kind of ideas of the city as a coherent, unified place. The city that has a central business district, a center, or even multiple centers, and then dissipates at the edges into kind of low-density residential suburbs before it disappears into the frontier in the hinterland. That idea strongly shapes the way that we think about cities and the way we experience cities. But if we look at city building on a global scale, it's no longer like this. Cities are being built in a much more haphazard way. The kind of in-between city, or the mass, large-scale metropolitan regions where what used to be called cities really blend one into another, where the environment is highly layered and highly checkered in terms of where the density occurs and where the low density occurs. What we really don't have the classic city, certainly in Africa and China, we don't have that classical city anymore. What we have is mass urbanization that spreads in all directions in a way that's hard to fit within these categories of center, periphery, central business district, residential suburb, and so forth. And in a way, what I want to argue as well is another term that we've sort of carried along with us is the idea of the third world city. I find that term to be not particularly helpful today because what I see is globally what's actually happening is that all cities around the world are engaged in this process of, and we're going to talk a little bit about, of building cities within cities. Implanting, like you see Stain City or Machacos or elsewhere, implanting them within an existing urban fabric or on the edges of existing urban fabrics, right? So that places in Africa can find the places are built that are more connected to the world economy, more connected to New York, to London, to Tokyo, to Paris, than they are to what's 10 miles outside of their borders. And increasingly, these satellite cities, these new cities that are being constructed as enclaves, completely surrounded. If you look at Stain City, for example, it's completely surrounded by a wall, and completely enclosed, and it has everything within those walls that satisfy the kind of criteria of work, live, and play. That people who live there don't really ever have to leave there. And in Johannesburg in particular, it's a city that has a very high crime rate, and there's equally high levels of fear of crime, and that justifies these kinds of projects. And it enables real estate developers to build them to encourage people to move inside the gates and never leave. A friend of mine, Gavin Shatkin, who writes on cities in India, refers to this as bypass implant urbanism. And I think it's more the model of what we're seeing in a world scale. The implant part is building enclaves for the rich and the super rich. And those enclaves are no longer gated communities just of residents, but they include commercial areas, shopping malls, and I'm going to show you Waterfall City in a second, which is building the largest mall in Africa, right next to one of the biggest malls in Africa. Someone is going to win and someone is going to lose because there's not enough consumers to buy all that stuff, all the Gucci stuff. And so these new satellite cities that are being constructed in dozens of African cities contain within them sites of work, leisure, entertainment, and residence. They're not like a gated community. They're 2 or 3 steps beyond a gated community. And I see this as the kind of future of urbanism on a global scale. We see it less in the United States and less in Europe, but we see it in most of the rest of the world. In this sense, that by the bypass implant urbanism, the implant is implanting these zones of wealth. Gavin Shatkin, my friend, works on Manila. Manila has a lot of ex-US military bases that are now being turned over to real estate developers that are building these enclaves for the wealthy. Manila has, I don't know, what, 10, 12, 15 million people. And that's the implant. The bypass part is creating then corridors that connect one rich place to another rich place. And the corridors take the form of dedicated roadways. They take the form of high-speed, like in Johannesburg, high-speed rail. Now a fast train, 200 miles an hour fast train built by the French that connects the rich areas of Johannesburg. And this is the pattern, I think, that's taking place. Bypass implant urbanism. And in part, what we saw in some of this little video that I just showed you sort of reflects that. Are we doing all right in time?
Yeah, we have I would say 20, 25 minutes and then time for questions.
Oh, okay. Oh, God. I just got to the preliminary part, but that's all right. For terms that I think that really resonate, that are really helpful, aggregate urbanism. Seeing cities as aggregated pieces rather than, we have this kind of modernist conception in our mind that cities somehow have to be functionally efficient, they have to be connected, they have to be coherent. I'm in an urban planning program, and my colleagues are still wedded to this idea that somehow what our job is to pull the urban fabric together. I think that it works in North America and in Europe, but in other parts of the world it doesn't work. So we have to find a new way of thinking about like what the role of urban planning. Aggregate urbanism, modular urbanism, fragmented city, archipelago city, the city of pieces. We have to find ways to think about then this is the future of the way in which cities are being built. And the extreme case of this are cities built within, cities built inside existing cities. So let's show the Lagos one first. That's the second one.
The Nigeria Rising.
Yeah. Let me turn it for offer. Give you a warm-up. In Lagos, the second or third largest city in Africa, an entirely new project is being built along the Bay, the Gulf of Guinea, called Eko Atlantic. Land is being reclaimed from the Atlantic Ocean, an area the size of Manhattan. And you'll see from the video what they're actually trying to do. But I'll jump ahead. You know, my conclusion is what this is going to do is incredibly fragment the existing city of Lagos, and in effect cement the exclusion of the urban poor in order to serve the interest of a privileged few. The project is being sponsored by the Chagori family, which are Nigerians of Lebanese descent, in alliance with the state government and a lot of private investment from elsewhere. And you'll see in the video a highly stylized image. And these images, someone was just telling me that they're actually, I mean, my facetious way of putting it is the same 25-year-old students that got degrees in design that are sitting in an office in Los Angeles and that are doing that Machacos. You can find a video in Machacos. They're doing the same videos. They all look alike. They get a contract to do it, and they're just throwing this stuff out as a way to sort of promote these places as being up to date and so forth. So this is about 2-3 minutes.
Lagos, the economic capital of Nigeria, the most populated country in Africa. With its coastal location and abundant natural resources, Lagos is ideally positioned to take a leadership role in the African economy and to become a major global force. But the gateway to the continent needs a new headquarters. Eko Atlantic is the answer. Rising on land reclaimed from the Atlantic Ocean off Victoria Island in Lagos, Eko Atlantic is Africa's brand new city. It will create prosperity, and it will be where business gets done. South Energex Nigeria Limited, the designers and city planners of Eko Atlantic, are creating a central boulevard in the first phase business district that will become famous not only in Africa, but the world at large. The boulevard will be about 2 kilometers long and 60 meters wide, similar in size to the Champs-Élysées in Paris or Fifth Avenue in New York. The whole business district will be spread over some 700,000 square meters of signature development opportunities. A conceptual design for an iconic tower is being developed. It stands at the northern end of the boulevard and will be more than 50 stories high. Its acquisition represents the high level of investor confidence in our emerging city. This wide avenue will feature an array of additional towers, climbing to around an average of 35 floors. As the centre for finance in Eko Atlantic, the business district will also feature the keynote edition of a luxury class shopping mall for retail and commercial use. Eko Atlantic's business district, with the impressive boulevard running through it as a centerpiece development, will not only change the face of Lagos, it will change the face of Africa. Fred Sadler.
Okay. Now, of course, you can see that's a combination of various elements. On the one side, there's highly stylized images of these big, tall buildings and so forth. That's actually probably never going to happen, anything close to that. And the other is this sort of celebration of Lagos or Eko Atlantic becoming a kind of financial hub for Africa. Now, a lot of other cities, similar projects. I could show you a dozen, maybe 24 very similar videos like this, all of which are promising very similar outcomes. But this is the kind of image. This is what's actually happening in Africa. Some of these places are actually existing. Eko Atlantic is actually being built. The Machakos one that I sent around, it may never come to fruition. There's a picture in the Machakos one of a high-speed rail that would connect Machakos to Nairobi. Never going to happen. The cost is way too high, and it would actually, the building the high-speed rail is about as expensive as building Machakos itself. Urban planners and architects that I talked to in Nairobi said, well, why not do this in Nairobi? Why is anyone going to come to Nairobi and then go 60 kilometers south? It's not going to happen. So these places that I mean, this one, Eko Atlantic, is going to happen. It's not going to quite look like this. And notice in the stylized video, there's no poor people, right? There's no people, informal traders on the street, which is what Lagos has. Those people, this place to look like this and to be like this requires a draconian policing force that is basically going to kick the poor out. And so my view about these things is, rather than listen to the celebratory rhetoric about what great things they're going to do for Africa, also look at the downside of it, is what things are going to do in order to make them happen, which is to build, in effect, a kind of police state for these locations. Yeah. Thanks for interrupting. That's good. No, it's fine. I want you to.
What came to my mind is people who are going to clean these buildings.
Yeah.
People, clerks for the
Yeah.
malls.
They're not going to live there. They're going to live somewhere else. And like the Stain City one that I passed around, this Dow Stain guy is a piece of work as a person. I won't go into all the details on them. I mean, what a friend of mine who actually worked with him said that he's in his 80s, he's got cancer. It's basically, the first thing he built was this gigantic, the biggest house in Africa for himself and for his family. They have 6 floors of parking bays for the 300 cars that the family owns, right? And he shows up in his bathrobe with someone walking behind him with gin and tonics. It's just a megalomania kind of project. But it embeds within it certain features that resonate within the kind of rest of the world. Let me just finish the thought. That resonate with the rest of the world is like 50% of the space there is going to be green space. I've been there. It's going to be green space, walking paths, bike paths, and so forth. So it brings in all these sort of new urbanist elements, but with a completely encapsulated site. Yeah.
This is probably a very simplistic question.
It's not.
The fact that I'm born in this country and I should know the answer given our own history. But how does something like Stein's, I was looking at that, how does that fly in a country with the history that South Africa has? I mean, I was there in ·98, and to see this now is so disappointing to me.
Yeah. How does it fly?
Well, there are 1 or 2 nice black people in the
Yeah,
For
pulling
sure.
the horse.
Yeah.
Security service.
Right. I feel like I've heard you speak at an African Studies conference a couple of years ago.
Oh my God, was it any good?
Yes, on a panel in cities, and it might have been about this, but what I recall was the security system involved like retinal scans. When you
Yeah.
drive up, no one who cannot pass through that barrier will get anywhere near the location.
Yeah, I'll talk about, the next one I'll talk about, I'll do that more. Yes, absolutely.
This is interesting you're showing this because, I live in Atlanta, which is, in my opinion, made two horrific choices to build two new stadiums when our school systems are terrible. And one of the baseball stadium is really about 1.5 miles from where I live, and the area, now they're trying to regentrify the entire area to bring it up, but there's low-income housing, and all those people will be forced out.
Out.
And it's very similar. It reminds me very much of regentrification, which is taking place in very many cities. I mean, you mentioned Detroit. I would imagine that whole center of town project they've been doing is probably resettling people. I don't know, but
Yeah, it's
I've never been to Detroit, but it's just very fascinating that it's almost like they're mirroring a lot of what we do in our cities when we regentrify the poor areas to become rich.
Yeah,
Which are often segregated by race.
Yeah, Detroit is a special case in a lot of ways. I mean, my view about Detroit, I'm very dystopian about it. Detroit is being reborn. It's being reborn by Dan Gilbert, who owns the Cleveland Cavaliers and made the contract with LeBron James, and a company called Quicken Loans, and they're rebuilding the center of Detroit. But there also happens to be about 700 or 800,000 people in Detroit, mostly African Americans, who have been abandoned by the city and are being abandoned by Dan Gilbert. And so it's a new Detroit, and it's a Detroit not being reborn. It's a Detroit, in my view, it's excluding the current residents to even further deprivation on the margins, despite the rhetoric. Garth?
Oh, I was just going to say, I studied one of these developments as well in Zambia. It was built by a Chinese company. And when I asked the developer, who was very proud of all of the security apparatus and all of the green development, both the greenery and the sort of eco-friendly architecture. And I asked, who was going to be doing the security service and who would be maintaining all of the nice parklands and the lawns and trees. And she said that they would have contracts for that. And I asked where those people would live, and there was no provision for that whatsoever. And so what happens, and I've seen this in enough of other African countries, I don't want to steal any of Martin's thunder, but those people have no provision in the new landscape, and so they create their own. And so in each of these places, what happens is another new city happens too, which is an informal settlement.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I guess I have a kind of a gut scared kind of a reaction to this, in that two things. One, they're building these huge places right in this climate of climate change, and I worry about that. But then I also have this dystopian sort of, if there's a populist uprising, I'm wondering, this kind of environment I find just terrifying. And I'm not talking just Africa, I'm talking anywhere, But I'm also thinking about, I live in Boston, the whole Back Bay was all filled in, and the city was doubled in size, and I think the city is still trying to figure out how to maintain that long term. And this is at a much larger scale. I'm just thinking 200, 300, 400 years out. How are they going to be able to maintain that sort of fighting nature kind of?
There's no thought to that whatsoever. Already there's the building they call it the Great Wall of Lagos, mimicking the Great Wall of China, where they're putting in reclaiming the land. It's already caused erosion on both sides in other countries along the coast. Let me show you this last one because I see I'm running out of time. And this is a place this is a place called Waterfall City. I've done research on this place for over 5 years. It's actually a place I know the best. This is between Johannesburg and Pretoria, right next to Stain City. And this is a real place. It does exist. For time, you can just cut it. You can find that on we're running out of time, but I did want to talk about this because it picks up at two very different themes, one of which that you mentioned. Waterfall City is divided into 14 separate precincts. As you can tell, it's a huge place. It's bigger, obviously bigger than the existing downtown Johannesburg. They're building a mall which is going to be, they say, going to be the biggest mall in Africa. And this emphasized primarily the corporate part of it. There's a number of different residential components that rank from really high scale, what's called the equestrian estates, which are big plots where everyone has a horse and access to stables and stuff like that, to 3 retirement villages, the first private medical school in South Africa, and then a private medical school, private hospital, and health clinics, because they're catering to the business of taking care of old people, and then entertainment. You know, the security system is incredible. I don't want to go into great detail, but to get into any one of the precincts, it's both a fingerprint identification system, license plate identification. Within 7 seconds, they can tell whether the car is legitimate or not, whether it's been stolen or not stolen, and eye scan, because you put your finger over like this, you have your picture taken, they have a picture identification, and then there's retinal scans as well. So the security is incredible. Now, what are the peculiar features about this place that are a bit shocking and unusual? It's owned by a single family. The family of Ismail Mia. a devout Muslim family that originally came to South Africa in the 1860s to work in the sugar plantations in Natal, came from the Indian subcontinent. The Ismail Mia family then became shopkeepers, made a lot of money, and bought this land, which was then in the middle of nowhere between Johannesburg and Pretoria, and they put a mosque on the land and used their income in order to fund projects for particularly orphan Muslim children all over the world. They were convinced by a group of real estate, the younger people in the family in their 40s, two men in the family, one a lawyer and one a businessman, were convinced by real estate developers, look, you have to do something with this land. It's the premier property in the metropolitan region. Developers then on two sides came together and formed a company called Waterfall Investment Company. The other peculiar feature about this place is that it's a completely private city, right? In accordance with the Quran and Muslim law, what I was told in the interviews was they could not, because it was religious land, they could not sell it. So the land is not sold, the land is rented. So any one of these these big corporates that are there don't own the land. They own their building, but they don't own the land where it sits. And so this creates in perpetuity, a financial stream to the Mia family, which then uses the money to invest in their global projects around help for disadvantaged Muslims all over the world. They are a very modest family. I've seen where the family lives, and their facilities are very modest. There are about 25 to 30 businesses in this waterfall city. Every single one of them is privately owned. So access to water, access to electricity, and the most up-to-date telecommunication systems probably in Africa. They're directly connected to that cable that comes across the ocean, and it lands near Mombasa, I think, for high-speed, for the kind of digital high-speed internet services and so forth. They're not dependent upon the municipality or even the Johannesburg government for anything. They buy water in bulk. They buy electricity in bulk, divide it up into pieces, and then sell it with a private company to residents. There are no police stations. There is no public presence in this place whatsoever. All the policing is done by a private company under contract called Seven Arrows, which is one of the most brutal companies in Johannesburg, and eventually they're going to create their own company, and then everything else is divided up into pieces. The first private medical school in South Africa, a private hospital, which is unusual in South Africa. So it's a completely privately owned, profit-driven enterprise. It's not a city, it's a profit-making machine. And it's fancy. A few other distinctive features in relationship to the South African Constitution, which is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, and a South African Parliament, which has maybe the second or third largest number of women representatives in Parliament. By law, because this is private property, and the property cannot be purchased, but can only be acquired through long-term lease. So homeowners, if you want to buy in the equestrian estates, you can get that on a 99-year lease, which is automatically renewed every year. So at the end of the year, it's again another 99-year lease. The commercial property is on a 49-year lease, but again, renewed automatically. Atterbury, one of the construction companies, has also done a trick here, which is they've done the same thing that Waterfall Investment Company did, which is they then own most of the buildings, which they then rent to the corporates. They will build them to specification. So it's a kind of rent-making, rent-seeking operation. It's really unusual, but I think it's a kind of prototype for what's going to take off in the rest of Africa. As we see new cities being built, they're going to be increasingly built as private profit-making machines where the public presence doesn't exist. Right? There's no public police. The rules and regulations are established by Waterfall Investment Company. I saw the book, which they refer to as the Bible, in a kind of a spoof against the Quran, which is what the Mia family consulted about how to deal with this property. The book then gives them all the rules and regulations. They have complete control over what people build and so forth. I went around with one of the leading developers. He stopped in front of a house in the equestrian estates, took out his tape measure, and he said that wall that they built is 2 inches too high. He wrote it down. We're calling our lawyers and they're going to take that fence down. Colors, styles, shapes, the whole environment is constructed according to a single rule book. With respect to the Constitution, there are no Christian churches in Waterfall City. There's a mosque. There are no Christian churches, which is a surprise. There is no liquor by the drink. There are no nightclubs. There are no liquor stores. You can buy alcohol in a supermarket if that's not the only thing being sold. You can buy pork, but it can't be the dominant meat being sold. So there's a kind of a imposition of certain rules and regulations that come from another place that get imposed upon this, layered upon this place. So I see it in a way as an extreme version of what may be the future of city building in Africa. And I'm sort of out of time on this. So, but this is what I would, what I would suggest that we think about.